All right, well, welcome, guys. Welcome to Tuesday Night Apologetics. Glad you guys are here. Starting a new book. It's going to be a fun one. Buckle up. It'll be a good time. Let me give you a couple announcements. This is not, Tuesday nights are like my candid announcements. I'll give you candid announcements. But about a month ago, I used to go to the zoo every Wednesday. I told you guys about it. And the next week, I decided not to go, which was great. I said, hey, guys, I'll be at the zoo. You can all meet me. And then I just didn't show up. So I just changed my schedule around. And then tomorrow, I'm going to go to the zoo with my kids. Anyone's invited to show up. And then I realized I'm going to go back to going every week. I missed it too much. So every week, I plan to be at the zoo at 3:30. And by 3:45, I'm going to start walking. If you show up and you want to meet me, just text me. If you're there at the zoo by the front gate, you're welcome to meet me. When I say front gate, it's by the monkeys, the big monkey head. If I don't meet you, I'm not looking for you. So you got to find me, and I'm not going to work to find you, but I'm just going to take my kids there. So if anyone wants to hang out at the zoo, I'm going to go every Wednesday at 3:30 is when I'm going to try to arrive and start walking around by 3:45. So that's the casual invite for you guys there. And then another thing, keep me in prayer. So I'm looking to figure out what to do. So I finished writing a commentary on Genesis. It's completely finished. I've already started Revelation, and I'm like a quarter of the way through that. And I realized I hadn't stopped to think about what to actually do to get it out. And so the question of who wants to read it, who it's going to be for, and whatnot. So we're probably, I'm shopping it a little bit to see if anyone wants to publish it. But frankly, my dilemma with this is, and I was talking to Jim about this a little bit, my dilemma with the publishing of this is simply, if I go with a big publisher, or I go with someone that wants to do it, it's gonna be a big process in the editing, and it could be another year, 6 months, who knows, before we actually get it out, which is fine, but I just feel like I want to crank out as much as I can do before I die, if that makes sense. Not that I feel like I'm going to die tomorrow, but God, who knows? And so I just want to crank out this commentary as fast as possible, which leads me to self-publishing. So that may be the route that we're taking. It's what we're looking at right now. But keep it in prayer. If it comes out, it'll probably be something that's like on Amazon and on Kindle, and you can get a hard copy made to order or something. But keep me in prayer. If you're interested in like helping edit or whatnot, contact my wife. If you don't know who my wife is, contact someone who knows who my wife is and just get a hold of her, and we can send you a copy to start reading through. But my thought is that there's value in it, but maybe there's not. I just feel like maybe after I die, there will be value. And at some point, somewhere, someone will read these things, and we'll see what happens with it. So in any case, keep that in prayer. But the book we're in tonight is called The Devil and Karl Marx. It's Communism's Long March. Let me find the cover here. The Devil and Karl Marx, Communism's Long March of Death, Deception, and Infiltration. It's by a guy named Paul Kengor, PhD. He's a Catholic, and so he's unapologetically Catholic, and that comes up a lot in the book, and I'm going to just skip over some of his Catholic stuff because it's absurd. But other than that, he's a great scholar, and he does understand the Marxist challenge very, very well. Al Mohler did an interview with him on his podcast. Like, this book is a very important book. Let me explain why we're doing it, and then I'll say a prayer. So Marxism as an ideology, you hear a lot. You hear about Marxism all the time. It's something that's the boogeyman of the Christian world. There's two big mistakes when we think about Marxism that I want to address at the front end of this book. The first is that Marxism as an ideology is about economics, or that it's political. Let me say that. Marxism is a political subject. We hear about it in politics. You'll hear the word Marxism used a lot. For example, the current presidential sort of debate moment, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are openly pushing forward for things like price controls, openly pushing forward to basically Bernie Sanders style, Marxism. We just lived through the CRT. We're living through CRT right now, and BLM. BLM as an institution, when they first came out, I opened up on a Sunday service. You can find it online, where I went to their website and I read to you. They openly admit that they're trained Marxists, and that so BLM and Black Lives Matter, the entire movement is based on cultural Marxism, and they're trained Marxists. Marxism is a philosophy of losers, and I'm not saying that in a Trumpian voice. It's a philosophy for people who don't like merit to take down people that deserve or have worked for things, and it is a philosophy of covetousness. But all that aside, it all just sounds so political. And what I want to address right now is that Marxism is a philosophy of evil. It is satanic. And it is not merely political, it is religious, ultimately. And so when we say religious, Kengor's point in this book is that Marxism isn't merely atheism, it's not merely secularism, it's not merely materialism, and it's not merely a byproduct of atheism. It is an outwardly visible, purposeful, satanic philosophy of death. And it is the leading philosophy of the leading presidential candidates right now in our country. It is in your schools. It is in your homes, in the books you read. It is on the shows you watch. It is in the cartoons we watch. These Marxist ideas have been infiltrating the West for a very, very long time. If you've ever had to deal with, like again, critical race theory in any fashion, form, or function, if we start talking about these things, you are dealing with the infiltration of Marxist ideology. And again, it sounds political. I want you to understand that this is a religious ideology. The second thing we're going to do, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to lead you through this first introduction and the forward kind of introduction of this book. Then I'm going to take you through a portion of an essay that's comparing Charles Spurgeon to Karl Marx, because they basically were contemporaries at the same time. And then we'll end, and then we'll start off. And so it's not for the faint of heart, but let me say a prayer. So God, I love you and ask that you would help me to teach well, to use this time well, that you would use this book well, that you would help us to understand the dangers of Marxism and understand the answer that the Bible has to it and Christianity has to it. Help us to know the power you've given us as lights in this darkness. Help us to understand who wants to snuff us out. Father, we are in a place that so easily takes the Bible unseriously. And I just pray that we wouldn't be those people. We would understand that what Marx did is that the Bible truly stands against the darkness he brings, and that we would understand our place in it boldly. Would you use this time in Jesus' name? Amen. All right, so let's just kind of talk through this for a little bit. So The Devil and Karl Marx, again, it's going to focus on what seems to be negativity. And the reason, I kind of addressed this on Sunday a little bit, but as the church, Marx is going to repeatedly talk about how the family institution and the church are the number one enemies that sort of stop the state from instituting sort of these Marxist ideologies of death. And it's interesting because the church in particular, as an institution, is more institutional, obviously, than the family. And it's the church that's been infiltrated the easiest in so many ways since the beginning of Marxism. Now it looks, when churches are starting to talk in a certain manner, you're starting to see it kind of infiltrate. And what's challenging for me is that for the church to be the church, we have to understand what's in front of us and not just kind of hear this as a boogeyman. So I'm going to give a little show of hands here. You guys have all heard of Marxism before, everyone here, right? So hands, everyone up. Okay. How many of you think you could articulate well what it is and actually recognize it? Raise your hands up if you think. A few of you, okay. That's what I want to get to. So this idea, I don't want it to just sound like a boogeyman, because it's just this crazy thing. It's like saying, blah, 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 blah. You're like, what is that? It's the thing. We all know it's bad, right? We feel bad about it. So this book is going to go through Karl Marx, but not just merely Marxism, but the guy who founded it. And his premise is that, again, it is satanic. So let me take you through it. The introduction is by Matthew Knowles, I believe, but Mark Knowles, who was his name? Michael Knowles, thank you, who annoys me somewhat, but his forward's fine. So let me just start with the forward and we'll get into it. So he says, Ronald Reagan described a communist as one who reads Karl Marx and an anti-communist as one who understands Karl Marx. I want to make sure you don't miss this. Ronald Reagan described a communist as one who reads Karl Marx and an anti-communist as one who understands Karl Marx. Notice what Reagan was saying in this. This is really relevant to understand our own history, that if you actually understand the claims being made, you oppose them instantly. So, for example, one of the claims that's being put forward right now from the Democratic Party, and particularly the Harris administration, is the idea of taxing people on their unrealized capital gains. Who's heard of this before? Anyone? Okay, so that sounds terrible. I don't know why anyone would be okay with that. That's even media people. Let's move on. That one's stupid. That would mean that if you had a house and it went up in value on Zillow, let's say, you didn't sell it, you didn't do anything, the value they would then tax you on, and they say it's only for people over 100 million. And you're like, oh, well, that's not me. It doesn't affect me at all. That's great. It does affect you. You're going to pay more for everything because people have businesses and whatnot. But there's another policy that they've talked about where she says, groceries are expensive. And we got to bring the price of groceries down. And so what we're going to do is we're going to lower the cost of groceries for people. So we're going to now put price cap. We're going to stop people from price gouging. Now here's what you have to believe to make that sound good. Groceries are expensive, and I don't like paying more money for groceries. And I would love for the mother government to come in and make groceries cheaper. And then here you come in with Kamala Harris coming in with whatever accent she needs to use that day to fit in and telling you that she's going to now lower the price of groceries. Now, that sounds nice. A communist would be someone who hears that. An anti-communist is someone who actually understands what she said. What she's actually saying is that the reason prices are high is that Ralph's and Vaughn's got together, and the bread lobby sat there and said, you know what, we're going to gouge people and charge more money for groceries. And so we're going to stop them and set the prices. And when that happens, immediately we know that supply and demand is no longer setting the price of groceries, and so then people you tend to have shortages, you tend to have a black market that starts to have things. You have like the lower income places don't carry the groceries that they need, so the government then has to subsidize it in, and so then you have to bring in money to give people the money they need for things, and very quickly you have bread lines. And this is this isn't an exaggeration. When you look at the countries where people lined up for bread lines, they lined up for bread lines that they wanted. At some point, they were told, you could have free food. Who doesn't want free food? Now you're in a bread line. And when you understand the claim that you say, hey, let's get rid of market caps and allow the government to dictate our grocers who make like less than a 2% profit, seriously, that's a crazy, crazy idea. Now you say to yourself, what does that have to do with Christianity? Well, we'll get to that. Pithy and true, at least at the time, but conservatives in the decades since Reagan won the Cold War have begun to forget just what makes Marxism so wrong. And their failure to articulate Marx's fatal flaw has left an entire generation, that's our generation, prey to the deadliest ideology in history, imperiling not only minds, but also souls. The majority of young Americans today hold a favorable view of socialism. Stop and let that sink in. The majority of young Americans today hold a favorable view of socialism, according to a 2018 Gallup poll. Now, before we get on to this has nothing to do with the Bible, by the way. This is absolutely antithetical to the Bible, which we're going to see. And so that's interesting. And especially when we think of the normal worldview that Christianity sort of built in the West, as we've been covering for so long, socialism is its antithesis. Socialism is on the rise more than 3 decades after conservatives thought it had died in the rubble of the Berlin Wall. In just the past few years, admitted socialists have won elected office through the country from the local to the national level. They have succeeded because while conservatives have blabbered themselves hoarse denouncing the economic effects of socialism, like I just did to you, they have ignored the deeper spiritual questions that actually move men's souls. That's why this book could not be published at a more appropriate or opportune time. Karl Marx envisioned, hear this out, Karl Marx envisioned a merely material world in which religion is the opium of the people and nothing matters but matter. Now, when we say this is a world where mere power matters. It doesn't matter, it's truly survival of the fittest. Rather than question this false vision, indeed our ability to question anything at all dispels it. Many conservatives have contented themselves instead to debate Marx on his own materialistic terms, saying things like this: socialist destroys economies. And they observe then also that socialism distorts markets, which is, again, what I just told you. And finally, socialism just doesn't work. We just went through the exercise, right? Here's socialism, and look at the argument. See how it doesn't work? It leads to bread lines. See, this is the game we're used to. In fact, as I was just giving you the examples I just gave you, you'd be like, yep, got it, I'm there. I'm totally, fully with it. That's not what this is about. Whether or not a political system works depends on what it's working toward. Socialism strives to tear down traditional society. And at that task, socialism has succeeded everywhere it has been tried, at least for a time. Let me reiterate what he just said. The argument we tend to make, especially to young people, but to ourselves, is that socialism just hasn't worked yet, or it doesn't work. And someone comes back and says, well, we haven't had the right conditions. In Venezuela, they had some problems here in corruption. If we had this environment, we could really try it out and it would work great. We just came through a moment where the government said we're going to print more money and we'll never run out of it because we can tax it. I mean, that's called modern monetary theory. And now we had 20% inflation. We're like, well, inflation's down to 3%. I'm like, that means it's down to increasing by only 3%. It's still that 20% increase that we had is still there. You didn't get rid of it. It didn't go down to before. And we're like, but again, economically, as we say all these things, that's the material world that we say. And we say, well, socialism doesn't work. And that's a lie. What this book points out is that socialism does work everywhere it's tried, because socialism's goal is not to build up society or for it to work. Socialism's goal is to destroy society. It is suicidal, not just economically, but at the very level of men's souls. It is dehumanizing. Its goal is dehumanizing from the start. The problem with socialism is not its inefficiency, it's the evil. Marx did not set out to tinker with markets and redistribute some wealth. He sought to radically transform society by changing human nature. He wanted to radically change how we viewed humanity. He hated religion because he opposed God, the author of human nature. He sided with Satan as he confessed in letters and ghoulish poetry quoted in these pages. We're going to see what he wrote. Ex-communists such as Arthur Koestler and Richard Wright came to call Marxism the God that failed. Karl Marx erred not through mere miscalculation, but through sin and heresy. People don't write like this very often. Kengor is a phenomenal scholar. Michael Knowles is telling you his view on it, but he's right. Unfortunately, the same softening on Marxism that took place in the realm of politics infected the church as well, at times through misunderstanding and others through outright infiltration. There's a book I'd urge you to read. Now, there's debate about the book, but it's called Shepherds for Sale, and it's how essentially these ideologies has infiltrated the church in very conservative circles. There's many of us have lived through that. Like, if you ever read Christianity Today, you have a Marxist infiltration of Christianity Today. You've had Marxist infiltration of Campus Crusade. You've seen this happening where all of a sudden we're getting articles constantly criticizing why conservatives shouldn't vote for Donald Trump for X, Y, Z, but no article at all is written about the different things we had. There's been sides, and we're like, why? Who are they representing? How is this happening? The book goes through that really well, but it's really a symptom of what we're reading in this book. It says the church has condemned Marxism since the mid-19th century, yet in 2019, the leading Jesuit periodical for the United States published The Catholic Case for Communism. Around the same time, the Holy Father and their group made common cause with communists, according to the left-wing Italian newspaper La Repubblica, saying, if anything, Pope Francis reportedly told the paper's founder, Eugenio Scalfari, it is the communists who think like Christians. One wonders if Karl Marx could hear the Pope's compliment amid the wailing and gnashing of teeth in his eternal abode. In his most famous Cold War speech, Ronald Reagan quoted Winston Churchill, who warned, the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we are spirits, not animals, and spirits must choose a side. I was sent an article recently, and again, it was talking about how Christians vote. And there's a lot of smoke and a lot of heat and very little light on these issues, but for the most part, the argument is, can a Christian vote for the left? Can a Christian vote as a Democrat? And the argument is the wrong argument. Of course, a Christian can vote as a Democrat because Christians do all sorts of stupid things, but a Christian that knows what they're doing voting for a Democrat is either stupid or not a Christian. It is an ideology that is no longer merely political. It is a religious ideology that tells us religiously about the value of human life. It tells us the value of happiness. It tells us the purpose of freedom and autonomy and redefines these things in ways that are so antithetical to what the Bible says. I don't know how a Christian can believe that. Now, when I say this to you right now, that sounds political. Politics right now is about theology. And I've been saying that to you over and over again, and there's nothing more theological on the left than Marxism. Marxism is the theology of the left. Euphoria at the fall of the Berlin Wall made utopians of otherwise hard-nosed conservatives who declared the end of history as such, ironically echoing grandiose rhetoric and balmy theories and of the ideologues they claimed to have defeated. But history did not end. If anything, has begun to repeat itself, first as tragedy, then as farce, just as Marx predicted in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. The evil empire collapsed, but evil spirits continue to prowl around the earth, seeking the ruin of souls, because we contend in the end, not against flesh and blood, but against the spirits of wickedness in the high places, which will endure to the end of the world. In the meantime, we must know our enemy, and in this book, we will see that enemy revealed. And here's why I like this intro. There's constantly, I get articles sent to me, and I'm not against you sending them. I'm not a conspiracy guy. I like true conspiracies, the ones you can see. The other ones you can't see, I'm just not interested in. But one conspiracy every Christian needs to believe in, and it's in Ephesians chapter 2. I'm going to go there briefly. If you go to Ephesians chapter 2, this is what the Bible says about our world. And you can't wiggle out of it. You can't think of it another way. I just want to make sure we don't miss it. So Ephesians chapter 2, I'm saying this at the outset so we kind of understand what's happening. So Paul writes to the Ephesian church. Chapter 2, verse 1, he says this, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. Let me stop and unpack what he said for a second. What Paul is saying is that as a Christian, something has changed about the course of your life. Not just that your salvation. It's not just that you punched your ticket to heaven. Something's changed about the course of how you think about the world. He says, previously, you were dead in the trespasses and sins. Now, we think that we're dead because God's mad at us, but he says these are the things in which you once walked. And further, he says, these are the things in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air. In other words, the world, the flesh, and the devil are all conspiring against you. And you were part of it. You went along with it. It was going along with your desire. There's something about Marxism that appeals to the natural man that makes us want it. But here's the conspiracy behind every government force across the whole world. I don't think that there's a guy pulling the strings. I don't think that you have a few people. I don't think that George Soros is running the world. I don't think that that's happening. I think that he has money, he's doing stuff, whatever. I think that Satan truly is constantly as possible, uniting many different forces for evil. And the spiritual warfare we wage is not, again, I always say, we're not casting out the Jezebels at work. It is a war of ideas. The spiritual warfare is a war of ideas and ideology. And so if we look at this, the course of this world, the evil one, Satan, is who we all once lived in the passions of our flesh. It implies that as Christians, we have a different way of thinking. So the world philosophy, if you will, that comes forth, what is it? What is the world philosophy? And we've talked about it in Truman and the rest. We've said it's the idea that self is the God. And we say, okay, fine. But what does that manifest into a view that we could look at? And ultimately, Marxism is a philosophy fit for hell. And so let me just go through the preface here, and I want to go through a brief article on Spurgeon, and then we're going to end. It's going to be short, I think. So here it is, the beginning. It says, the purpose of a preface is to briefly set the table for what is to follow. In a book on the evil that is communism, that's a tall order. The blood banquet that is communist ideology could not be sufficiently laid out in a vast hall of volumes, let alone a mere preface. To adequately convey the array of victims of communism is humanly impossible. I will restrict these opening observations to a few pages, sketching only generally the dance of death, to borrow from Marx's strange poetry, orchestrated by the handmaidens of this killer ideology. It is important to start with a presentation of the numbers, the estimated number of victims. They speak for themselves, that is, for communism. Now listen why we're doing this. Any ideology with a trail of rot like this is not of God, but of the forces against God. It is not of God's creation, but of fallen angels' anti-creation. It is not of the light, but of the dark. In other words, our worldview dictates the world we live in, the lens we use. And I've said this before. If you go into Israel and you could look at the border of Syria and Israel, I urge you to do this. There's a coffee shop on the top of one of the mountains. You can look over and see the border between Syria and Israel right there. The coffee shop is called Coffee Anan. It's a pun. And so you can go up there and you can look out in the viewfinder. And when you look, you could go on the internet and see it. You will see, it looks like the old school My Little Pony. I'm so old, but like where you'd have like the pony land and then you'd have the dark place, which is like smoke and ugliness. You look and it is a wasteland, just a total wasteland. And then there's like almost like an invisible line and it is lush, fertile crops organized in line. And it's like a straight line. And you have to ask yourself what you're looking at. Are we supposed to think to ourselves that that line exists because there's a genetic difference between the Jewish people and the Syrian people, that the Jews are genetically smart or something? Or maybe we say that line exists because the land happens to be fertile and there's like a fault line, let's say, where the ground just happens to be wasteland on one side. Or both those things are untenable. Or what we can say is the Syrians and the Semites, they all have genetically the same genetics, basically. They're all people that have the same smarts. And the ground has the same stuff. And what you're looking at is a dividing line between two nations with two worldviews, one that makes life and one that creates death. And you can visibly see a worldview of a people. You say, well, one has poverty, one has wealth. I'm like, okay, one leads to wealth and one leads to poverty. And there's nothing that you can do to get out of it. And when you look at these two worldviews side by side, that's what you see. There's a reason and this is one of the biggest challenges you see, like the philosophy that leads to that. One of the things we see in our country right now, when I grew up in San Diego, downtown San Diego was a great place to go. I would go on, not dates, honey, on the phone, but like let's say I went out with some friends and we went to downtown, we go to Horton Plaza Mall, which won a bunch of awards. How many of you are old enough to remember when Horton Plaza Mall was a nice place to go? Yeah, you could go there. It was great. It is not a nice place to go right now. I was there the other day downtown walking to go eat at Hedegado, the all-you-can-eat churrascaria, which I think, I don't know if they're still around, but I was walking by a person who was on the ground with their butt in the air and their ding-dong hanging out as they're laying down, saying that like just no pants on. And a puddle of urine. Just walk right by. People running, yelling. Like that didn't, now here's the question you have to say is, did that just invent? Did we just invent that? Did it just start? Did drugs start? Well, drugs are new. We had drugs before. We had homelessness before. What changed? Stupid policies changed. Stupid worldviews changed. Stupid ways to view things. And if we can't be smart enough to look at that, okay, but guess what? In this case, understanding the full scope of communism and understanding what it is going to do just like what I just said. It's like looking through that viewfinder and seeing Syria and seeing Israel and being like, wow, there's two worldviews here. No other political ideology has produced as much wretched poverty, rank repression, and sheer violence as communism. None. In country after country, implemented in various forms across wide-ranging nationalities, traditions, backgrounds, faiths, and ethnicities, communism coldly and consistently violated the full sweep of most basic human rights, from property to press, from speech to assembly, from conscience to religion. It's a big statement. So restrictive was communism in the 20th century that its implementers routinely refused to allow citizens the right to exit, that is, escape, the destructive systems imposed within their borders. In some cases, they erected walls to herd and fence in the masses they claimed to champion. If you stop and think about this for a second, this bears repeating. So restrictive was communism that its advocates had to build walls poured with cement, topped with barbed wire, patrolled 24/7 by secret police with automatic weapons turned on their own citizenry to keep their people from fleeing. I love this. There was a story recently, this happened maybe in the last year or so, and I think it was Elon Musk moved out of California, whatever. They're looking at some of the stuff. One of the guys moved out, and they're saying like, "Hey, some of the tax law they're talking about. We need to cause people to have to pay taxes even after they leave. It basically is trying to force you to stay, and like basically you can't leave. Like you're not allowed to leave. And you think to yourself like, this is crazy. We had a ton of people from our own church flee California because of when the inflation was happening and some of the taxes, and they could do that. But it was interesting listening to some of the press, if you were paying attention at the time, talking about ways to make it hard for people to leave with their business and their own tax dollars. And it was interesting to see. That's a very small version of what we saw in Berlin with the Berlin Wall. It was meant to keep them in, not to keep them out. And any philosophy that caused you to build a wall to keep them in. The ultimate symbols of that repression were the Berlin Wall and the frozen people zoo that was the Soviet Gulag. Even then, those are just two symbols of the repression. We could point to so many more. The killing fields of Cambodia, Romania's Petetsky prison, the NKVD's Lubyanka basement, Fidel and Shea's La Cabana execution house, and modern concentration camps such as North Korea's Camp 22 or China's Laogai, where to start, where to end. Communism's most successful form of redistribution was not wealth, which the ridiculous system fails to produce, period, but government-orchestrated crime. Let me say this again. The number one thing that communists successfully can redistribute well more than any other thing is government-orchestrated crime. Let me just stop for a minute. This is heavy. I'm hitting you heavy. Let me just make sure you don't miss this. Nothing I'm saying is false. None of it. None of it's exaggerated. In fact, when he starts getting the numbers right now, his numbers are so unexaggerated, they're like half of what I think they are. So anyways, let me just keep going. Everything was so nationalized and so centralized that it was as if the government seized crime too. What do I mean by this? You know, when the government takes over running things, right, that's bad because they can dictate stuff. They can kind of dictate what that looks like, and they can take and seize things as they will. I don't know if recently, if you look at your water bill or you look at your electricity bill, it feels like they can just change the number to whatever it wants, and you just are stuck. And if you work for SDG&E, I'm not saying you're wicked or evil, but you are like a tax collector. I'm just saying. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. But it just seems like, well, now they run it. There's no competition. They could just say, well, this is what it is. I mean, at least with the internet, as bad as it is, there's at least some competition, like, I guess, right? Like AT&T or Spectrum, I mean, you can compete. But when it comes to some of these ideas, and you really start to see it if you say, well, I'm going to get solar for my home, right? And so we're going to have solar, and I have a battery, and I produce it. But they don't need it that time, so then they waste the solar and charge you if you don't charge your car at the right time, and it's going to charge you a premium. Like, wait, I thought I owned the car and the electricity I produced because I had solar. Nope, you don't. They do. Says who? Says who? It's just amazing to me when you realize that the government can do that and just be criminal. I mean, that's one of the things we dealt with during COVID when the government told people, you can't go out and meet in public, and Gavin Newsom was eating in public at the French Laundry, which is a fancy pants restaurant. And I saw one day I went up to visit Carlsbad during that time, and every restaurant that was open put a sign on their door that said French Laundry. I just thought it was brilliant, but it just felt criminal. And really, there are a few more proficient political gangsters than communist leaders. Al Capone looks like Mr. Rogers compared to a Pol Pot or Nikolai Kuczynski. It's no exaggeration to say that a Jeffrey Dahmer or Jack the Ripper could not begin to compare to a Felix Dzerzhinsky or serial rapist Lavrentiy Beria and she'll scare of victims, not even close. Communism committed a multitude of crimes, not only against individual human beings, but also against world civilization and national cultures, wrote Stephen Courtois, editor of the classic Harvard University Press work, The Black Book of Communism. Communism's regimes turned mass crime into a full-blown system of government. Let me say that again. Communism's regime turned mass crime into an actual system of government. In both theoretical and practical form, communism deprives individuals of their unalienable rights. It is a totalitarian, atheistic ideology. Communism's chief form of redistribution is repression, crime, and murder. Now, let me just make sure we don't miss what I'm saying right now. The way it works, communism works, is this. The reason it has to be atheistic is it says is basically predicated on the vacuum of secularism, which says who? So in other words, all the anti-art, all the anti-music, all the anti-stuff we put out is daring you to say, I don't think that's beautiful, I don't think that sounds good, I don't think that's art. And they say, according to who? And what they're trying to do is deconstruct the idea that there's any objective standard. And then they say, and since there's no God, and since we are just evolved here, it's just material matter, there's nothing except goo to you via the zoo, there's no impulse, the mind, all that's fake, it's just an illusion, it's not real. And so all of a sudden you say to yourself, well, how do we know what to do? How do we know what's right? He says, well, whatever works for the most people. The most powerful voice in the room is the only one that can say says who. So in other words, I say, well, I don't like that. That's not art. And they say says who? And they say the government. That's what you do when you're a child. You start fighting and you say, well, it's mine. No, it's mine. It says who? And you say mom. And so as Christians, we appeal to authority and say God, says God. The atheistic communist also appeals to authority, and they also appeal to a God named the government. And that's what would happen. A communist regime comes into a culture and begins by saying there is no God except the government. And so this is an atheistic idea. So if your inalienable rights, go back to this. As Americans, understand how untenable communism is from our founders. We say that we as individuals are endowed with inalienable rights because we're made in the image of our Creator. That is, no one gave them to us but God. So the government did not give you the rights according to our country and our Declaration of Independence. The government didn't give you the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. God did. The government didn't give you the right to free speech. God did. The government, as a free people, God gave you those rights. And all the restrictions we put were not put upon your freedoms. They were put upon a government that tends to repress freedoms. So our form of government limits the power that individuals have because we know that power corrupts absolutely. And so it tries to limit the power, and it's trying to limit the power of government to infringe on your rights because the natural form of government is to do such a thing. And that's our country. That's the craziness of our country. That's why it's such a big deal when we give away our freedom so casually, because it's a big deal you have them in the first place. When the government tells you what you can and can't do, they're telling you something in a realm that they don't have any authority over. They can't tell you, like a lot of the things that they pretend to tell you because they didn't give you those rights in the first place. The government cannot take your guns away because they didn't give you the rights, according to our Declaration of Independence, to have them in the first place. And so there's a lot of constitutional angst about what do we do about that. I need a concealed carry permit. I was like, there's a lot of debate about all these things because the government is stepping in realms that our founders said they don't have a right to say. That includes speech, that includes freedom of religion, and so many other things. So the way that most of the policies were enforced during COVID were enforced by what? Pressure from private business. Because in our country, we couldn't use the police. So they used private businesses to bully each other and use social pressure to make everyone obey. And we went along with it. We went along with it because we don't understand, we didn't recognize. Like I'm telling you, the day that we were here, and I was, like all the pastors can tell you, I lost my mind. 14 days to do what? To flatten the curve. Remember that? 14 days to flatten the curve. And remember the argument? We have to make sure that we don't go out in public, which is going to prolong COVID cases. But we have to do that because we don't want hospitals to be overwhelmed and not have ventilators. Remember that? And so that was the argument. And the best part is I went on video on our church and made an argument and made a video and said, they made an argument and I'll buy it. And after 14 days was over, no one said a word. They just said, oh man, now we've got to stop the spread. Wait, time out. You're talking about like flu-like symptoms, like you're talking about flu. How do you stop the spread? Who agreed to that? Give me an argument. I thought you said you're going to spread it out, which is going to prolong the spread, not stop the spread. When did that happen? Everyone's like, stop the spread, stop the spread. We just listened to stopping the spread, and all of the lockdowns were predicated on stopping the spread. No one made an argument even the question of it was like crazy. There was an article that some ridiculous person wrote saying that COVID spread in the ocean faster than it does on land because the sea breezes, and so they shut down the beaches. And we all lived in a place for a moment where it was illegal to go to the beach during COVID. What do you need when you're sick? Fresh air, wind? Nope. Stay inside. Get fat and watch Netflix. Keep the liquor stores open, though. And we're just like, yeah, science. Trust the science. The fact we did that, like, guys, I want us to be ashamed because it's ignorant. If we just even watched any history, you would have recognized right away the government doing what governments do. It's what we naturally see. And as Christians, let me say this again, Romans 13 tells us to obey the government. It tells us to obey the governing authorities. And here's the challenge. We don't live in a magisterium with a king. We live in a free society governed by the Constitution, and our elected officials are elected under the auspices of them holding up the Constitution. And we have checks and balances so that when they don't hold it up, we're meant to resist. That's built in our Constitution. So being a good citizen, a Romans 13 citizen in America, means resisting tyranny, not obeying it. The whole reason for, do you understand that this is part and parcel what this book is dealing with? Like, we have to understand what that means. But all that looks crazy when you understand that communism deprives individuals of their unalienable rights. And it's always under the Reichstag fire. It's under the idea of, I'm going to keep you safe. The Patriot Act was to keep us safe after September 11th, and then it was used to spy on our own people. It is totalitarian, atheistic in its ideology. Totalitarian means it's going to obey. Like in Australia, you can watch videos. A guy got arrested and beaten for trying to buy a burrito. He snuck out to buy a burrito, and they ran down the street. My favorite video is these guys that set up a mannequin by the beach, and when the cops came, they came and saw a mannequin, and they're filming, and they just ran off the other way. But it's totalitarian. Communism's chief form of redistribution is repression, crime, and murder. And I love this because it's redistribution of this. What does that mean? You empower other little tyrants, little tiny tyrants, and they love the repression too. You go into every state, the DMV is going to look the same. Why? Do you think that if you work at the DMV, I'm not saying you're a jerk, but there's a lot of annoying bureaucrats that can work in the DMV. It doesn't work well. Why does the DMV feel like it feels? Because you give people a little bit of power, and they're annoyed at the long lines and the inefficiencies, and that they're going to basically hold that over you, and you can have that happen, and it's going to be the same in every state. Do you think if they have a DMV meeting of evil cabal of people getting together and be like, let's figure out how to make the DMV evil everywhere it goes? Or do you think the system is so centered on allowing human nature to flourish in such a negative way that maybe we built a system that so rewards terrible behavior? Under communism, there is no profession of self-evident, inherent, inalienable rights. That is absolute rights endowed by the creator of human beings to begin with, and thus protected by a just government. Governments weren't instituted among men to help secure the rights. Such rights, as Thomas Jefferson put it, no communist governments took away those rights, depriving them, robbing them, absconding with them in the name of a totalitarian system that at some point promised to usher in utopia. Communist governments took away those rights. Guys, we sat in our homes on Independence Day and then didn't put fireworks because they said we couldn't. Says who? My favorite scene watching that was when they said, we should have fireworks. Oh my goodness, what's this? And it was a helicopter going over LA, and there's more fireworks than you've ever seen. There was like, and the newscasters like, oh my goodness, this could start fires. Oh my goodness, what's happening? And I was just like, for one moment, I thought, yes. And then everyone the next day is like, are we allowed to come out yet? The reason I was so viscerally upset by it is like, if you study history, you just had to understand what was happening. Communist regimes did not just commit criminal acts. Observed Martin Malia, a Harvard PhD and professor at the University of California, Berkeley, noting that there have been non-communist states that likewise committed criminal acts, but they were criminal enterprises in their very essence, on principle, so to speak. They all ruled lawlessly by violence and without regard for human life. When you stop and ask yourself, how is it fair? If I said to you, hey, I got an idea, Jim, do you think it'd be great if I could take Chris's money and give it to Tina? He's like, yes. I'm like, Chris, I come over and I say, Chris, give me your money. And he says, no, and I take all the power of the government, and I just take his money, and I go give it over to Tina. And so I give that money to Tina. You feel like you just stole from Chris to give to Tina. Hey, where's the rights? I didn't have the money. I just stole Chris's money and gave it to Tina. And if I'm like, this makes sense. At a certain point, people will say things like, they need to pay their fair share of taxes and blah, 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 blah. You're talking about other people's money. That's called covetousness. And at a certain point, we've ensconced that as an actual political system that we think is viable. Listen to me very carefully right now. As a Christian, that is a sin. It is the same as greed, gluttony, lust, and any other such thing. It's called covetousness. The Bible talks about it a lot, and we have an entire political system built on equity, which is that someone has more than you. So what? It's not equitable. So what? So what? Where in the Bible, and the very idea that we would dress it up as biblical, that I need to take, Jesus would have wanted me to take Chris's money and give it to Tina. I didn't know that. When you say it that way, do you see how thuggish and evil it is? And that's what it is. If Chris wants to give his money to you, he's welcome to. But the idea that I'm going to take it by force and make him do it, that's literally what so many of our boring policies about taxes is about. It's to redistribute wealth, but it's not based on merit. It's not based on anything. What right, if you go sell something privately to another person in your home, let's say, hey, Brandon says to me, hey, I got a new, an RC car. I don't know why that came in mind. And I'm going to sell it to you. And I'm like, great, I want to buy it. If the government can find a way to tax it, they will. What does the government have to do with it? At a certain point, that kind of taxation really is theft. And we live in a country that was literally predicated on the idea that no taxation without representation. It blows my mind. The communist culture of death has been prolific. Whether by bullet, by starvation, by exposure to the elements, by war and terror against internal citizens and enemies of the state, or by whatever means, how many victims, truly only God knows. Let me make something really clear really quickly about the Second Amendment. In our country, the idea that we have a First Amendment makes sense, but the Second Amendment does not make sense. There's nothing in the Bible that would say the right to bear arms. Where does that come from? It comes from the idea that the First Amendment is important. You have the right to free speech and assembly and all that, and that governments want to infringe on that by nature. And the Second Amendment exists to make that impossible or hard to do, that we are a nation that is armed to protect us from the natural infringement that can happen from the government. The most American thing that happened during COVID was the barber that decided to stay open, and the government went to shut him down, and you had a bunch of people with AK-47 standing out front and said, nope, that is the most American thing you can see. There is nothing more American than that. People are like, I don't know if I like that. Well, move to England. There's another reason, though, that you hear arguments about the Second Amendment. It's always based on school shootings. It's always based on disarming citizens and gun buyback programs. What does that have to do with Christianity? Nothing. But it has to do with the First Amendment. It has to do with government's rights, because when you get rid of the Second Amendment, and all of a sudden you can enforce it. Do you realize the types of lockdowns that happen in Australia happen because they bought back all their guns? You can't go take guns. You can't go and shut things down like they did in Australia here because everyone's armed to the teeth. No, we just want to get rid of assault weapons. What's that? When you start looking at the argument, you're like, what is the actual argument? Does that make you uncomfortable? I'm saying, look at the actual argument. What's the logic behind it? Well, there's too many guns. Okay. You live in America. Is the answer to get rid of, it's a gun-free zone. I wish the school shooters knew that. They didn't follow the sign. Go figure. In 1999, this is how old this is, 1999, not this book, but the Black Book of Communism endeavored to attempt the impossible task of tabulating a Marxist-Leninist death toll in the 20th century. And it came up with a figure approaching 100 million. 100 million people died because of the ideology we're talking about, the ideology that we flirt with in our country. USSR had 20 million deaths, China 65 million, Vietnam 1 million, North Korea 2 million, Cambodia 2 million, Eastern Europe 1 million, Latin America 150,000, Africa 1.7 million, Afghanistan 1.5 million deaths. The International Communist Movement and Communist parties not in power, about 10,000 deaths. The Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation, the preeminent US-based center for detailing communist crimes, cites the figure of 100 million deaths. And numerous others agree and could be listed here. Dr. Malia aptly noted that the communist record offers the most colossal case of political carnage in history. Period. So remember that example I told you about Israel and Syria, and you see it, and you say, here I see crops and devastation. Now you have a philosophy, and let's just talk about capitalism for a second. Let's talk about the American experiment that we're a part of. If you don't understand American exceptionalism, this isn't just randomly saying that we're in a good nation. For the first time in the history of the world, our country has exported more ability for countries to have wealth. We brought more people out of poverty. We brought more people the ability to have wealth. We brought more people to have opportunity than any country in the history of the world, period. Contrast that with communist ideologies that are sitting here trying to stand in judgment against America and say America started in 1619 with slaves. That ideology has caused, and we're going to see closer to like 150, 200 million deaths. It doesn't create any economy. It doesn't help anyone. It only destroys, deconstructs. It's terrible. But even here, there's something still more shocking. These frightening numbers are very conservative. Take the figure-laden Soviet Union, where the Black Book recorded nearly 20 million dead. Alexander Yakovlev, a high-level Soviet official who became one of Mikhail Gorbachev's chief reformers and who in 1990s was given the official task of trying to add up the victims, estimates that Stalin alone annihilated 60 to 70 million people. His figures are consistent with those long estimated by the likes of Nobel dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, among others. Now, listen, when you go to UCSD campus, we used to try to do this Tuesday night at a place called the Che Guevara Cafe. Check out his death toll sometime. But yet people, it's cool to wear the shape. Like, communism's cool when you're in college. It's because, and I'm going to say this honestly, like, it's because you're ignorant. And they prey on it. Most accounts of the overall Soviet death toll, Stalin plus other leaders, exceed 33 million, some twice that. Cold War historian Dr. Lee Edwards, citing the epic work of Democide by political scientist R.J. Rummel, as well as the research of Solzhenitsyn and the great Soviet scholar Robert Conquest, and still others, estimates that the Soviet governments were responsible for the death of 61.9 million on their own from 1917 to 1987. And yet the Bolsheviks would be matched, if not outdone, by China's Mao Zedong, who by numerous estimates was responsible for the deaths of at least 60 million in China. And more likely over 70 million according to the latest biographical historical research. When you look at the Chinese culture and the way they have sort of a system that operates on like a big brother thing, and they have a social credit score, is the idea that if you do certain things, you have good credit, socially, you can have rewards. And if you don't do good things socially, you can have them taken away. Don't you dare think for a second those on the left don't want that kind of system here. That is as communistic as it gets. Then there were the killing fields of North Korea, Cambodia, Cuba, Ethiopia, Eastern Europe, Africa, and more, and among them North Korea's pile of body bags unquestionably stacks higher than the 2 million listed in the Black Book's bullet points. Really, the death generated by communist governments in the 20th century, and primarily in a more concentrated period from 1970 to 79, is surely closer to 140 million. And I would argue when you really look at the numbers, you're really talking closer to 250 million. I mean, it is so many people. This would equate to a rate of multiple thousands dead per day over the course of a century. Even Adolf Hitler got nowhere close to that. In fact, neither did the two deadliest wars in history, World War I and II, which need to be combined and doubled to get near communism's butcher bill. Let me say that again. You'd have to take World War I and II, combine them, and then double them just to even get near the kind of cost of communism on human life. The highest estimates of the death produced during the entirety of the Spanish Inquisition, a period of some 60 years, come nowhere near the level of death in Stalin's military purge or even Lenin's first year in power. When you stop and think to yourself, how did all these people die? What is happening here? Did you start to think about that? This is a crazy picture. Anonymous wise guys randomly surfacing and disappearing on the internet, many of them millennials born after the fall of the Berlin Wall, emerged to dispute or nitpick the numbers. And the author says this, fine, go for it, guys, who cares? Truly only God knows the real number, and the devil truly is in the details. This much we do know, beyond dispute, this was and remains a lethal ideology of boundless destruction and stupidity. One needs to think of viruses, bacteria, plagues, disease to approximate this level of man-made death. And even then, a malicious modern virus is COVID-19, which placed the world in lockdown in the year 2020, comes nowhere close to communism's fatality rate. Mankind has survived all manner of evil diseases and plagues, said Ronald Reagan. But can it survive communism? Reagan called communism a vicious disease. For good measure, he added that communism is neither an economic or political system, it's a form of insanity. What sort of warped idea could unleash such agony? Conventional explanations simply don't suffice. The fullest answer resides in the realm of the spirit, a spiritual explanation. This is where his book is fascinating to me. He says, the dogged, hell-bent pursuit by many of such a perverse ideology, immediately evident as idiotic and unworkable from a cursory skim of the Communist Manifesto, is an utter mystery not explainable by mere rational understanding. Let me see what he said again. He's like, if you actually look at what it's stating, it is pure ridiculous that anyone would say, that makes sense. We should do that. And yet people love it. And he said, the only reason that you can explain that is that it's satanic. And you say to yourself, is that a good argument? It's a phenomenal argument. I love that, for example, people do not unite to oppose Buddhism. People are not united to oppose, the philosophy and the ideology of Islam, but everyone unites to diss Christianity. Everyone unites to diss Christianity. And when they diss Christianity, notice they're not like, you never hear people go out and talk about how like Mormonism's the worst. No one cares. It's more Jehovah's Witness. When's the last time you're like, man, we got to stop those Jehovah's Witnesses? It's always Bible-believing conservative Christians that everyone opposes across the board. You literally have lesbians marching next to people in hijabs opposing biblical Christianity. It points to that satanic conspiracy like nothing else. Similarly, you see the same type of thing with Israel, surrounded by all the nations that hate her, similar to what you see in the pages of the Bible. Nothing explains that kind of hatred except Satan and the Bible. That's what he's saying about communism. He says, this was and is flatly a diabolical ideology, and with an inexplicable attraction to its adherents, it possesses a bizarre, seductive quality to its ideological cultists. And yet, those same cult-like adherents denounce religion as the opiate of the masses. They have denounced it with a passionate hatred. This book deals with the grim, disturbing, militant atheism and intense anti-religious elements of Marx and others. It's not a full-blown biography. It just starts with him. It goes to some of his disciples. He wants to just make the case that Marx wasn't a mere atheist that came up with a belief that wanted to help people. He was very specifically satanic in the way he's talked. He says, for the record, I'll state up front, I have not encountered any evidence of doing seances or anything like that. Regardless, there was a fanatically deep hatred of religion and flirtation with the dark side that is undeniable and chilling in his poetry. When you look at some of the observations from the people that wrote about him, one journalist, Karl, wasn't unique among contemporaries and biographers who observed on record Marx shouting and repeatedly chanting words like from Faust and describing it as mocking, trying to take under a spell and possessing eyes like a wet goblin. To be sure, this is very much a short list, and some of these were likely in jest and expressed with weird playfulness, though this isn't always the case. Now listen to this very carefully. The frequency of such observations of and by Marx really is quite bracing and far too frequent to shrug off. Readers will see that there are way too many of these to blindly ignore, and no figure that I've ever studied or pursued in biography was described in language like this, and I'm sure every biography reading this now will nod in agreement. There were times when Marx seemed to be possessed by demons, recorded Robert Payne in his chapter, The Demons, in his groundbreaking seminal 1968 biography of Marx. A prolific academic biographer of Marx and a respected scholar and academic, not expected to level such shocking charges. He said this, he had the devil's view of the world and the devil's malignity. Sometimes he seemed to know he was accomplishing the works of the devil. That's not how, normal historians write. And this guy's a buttoned-up historian being like, this guy's the devil. Like, when you got that, it's like when the quiet guy gets mad, you know it's bad. Most sentient human beings have at least a flickering notion of the immense suffering caused by communist ideology and the aftermath of Marx's Communist Manifesto penned 2 centuries ago. But far too many people separate Marx the man from the evils ushered in by Marxism. It's a grave mistake. Not only are the results of Marxism very much the result of his ideas and his very pen, but he himself penned some of the most downright devilish things as he put it forth. Karl Marx wrote not only about the hell that was communism, but about hell itself. In some such cases, Marx portrayed himself as chosen for hell, or that he chose hell for himself. In other cases, he, in the role of the master of hell, consigned others to it. He writes, "Thus heaven I've forfeited, I know it full well," wrote Marx in one of his poems. "My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell, and I embrace it." Alas, this book offers a close, careful look at the genuinely hellacious side of the ideology. We see here in this book a long march of destruction, deceit, manipulation, and infiltration. It doesn't stop with Marx, who's only beginning. It merely starts with him. He was the launching point for an assault on religion that eventually included a penetration of churches and even seminaries. The infiltration had a terrible success in communist countries, but its tentacles reached also into free nations, including the United States of America. You may be interested in knowing that we have preachers active in churches who are members of the Communist Party. Candidly admitted Earl Bowder, General Secretary of the Communist Party USA, to the Student Union in 1935. We'll get into this when we go in the book. I want to skip over it, but just talks about how the communism infiltrated churches. But he says this in the end of this forward. He says, many of today's naively self-described socialists and democratic socialists have no idea of the rancid roots of this poison tree, and that's true. I think if your kid goes to college and starts spouting off about the patriarchy and going to marches, I don't think they're reading Faust. I don't think they're into the devil. But they are dumb. The Bible gives them a category. It's called the fool. And they're in their folly. Like, that's the category. They're a fool. They're being a foolish person. They're saying foolish things. And we say, oh, that's just youth. Is it, though? Should it be? I don't know where in the Bible we're like, foolishness is great when you're young. It doesn't say that. It says the parent who sires a fool harms himself. Hiring a fool is like hiring an archer who shoots you in the back. It's better to be on the rooftop than a fool with their folly. I'd rather meet a she-bear robbed of her cubs than with a fool in their folly. Do you think that's a good description for how we should send our kids to become fools? And when they're in their foolishness, they're saying foolish things, and we just like, they're there, I get it, I understand it, I can feel you, I hear you. As the people outside are chanting for Hamas, Harris goes, I hear you. Why would you pander to fools? And why would we? Let me explain why I brought this up. One of the articles I read did this. It's a founder's article. It's called Karl Marx versus Charles Spurgeon, an epic struggle for the souls of men in the 19th century London. The reason I love this article is it kind of puts to death the idea that the subject matter is not, relevant for us as the church. So I'm going to take you a few places through the article, but his basic argument is these two grew up as contemporaries, and they understood that they were putting two ideologies in opposition to one another. And it's fascinating because Marxism sounds so much like 90s and stuff. It's very relevant. But this is 1890s, 1990s. I mean, you see these things. Once in London, Marx spent his days at a British museum preparing his magnum opus, Das Kapital, a critique of capitalism that could fill a sizable pothole. Although he fashioned himself as a scholar, he was more of a dilettante, a dabbler in scholarly activity. A scholar begins with a tentative thesis and allows the facts to dictate his conclusions. He has, in other words, committed the truth. In sharp contrast to this methodology, Marx, like the woke media, woke policies, and woke academic people we see today, began with the conclusion and worked backward from it, facts be damned. When you use the word woke, that's a term we hear all the time. When you hear the term woke, it means Marxist. It says, what does woke mean? Marxism. Marxism. Here's a quote. Communism abolishes eternal truths. Now, stop for a second. Who do you think wrote that? That sounds like someone criticizing communism, right? Here's a criticism of communism. Communism abolishes eternal truths. Nope, Marx wrote that. Not as a bug, but as a feature. I'll say it again. This is written from Marx as a positive. Communism abolishes eternal truths, he declared openly in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He said, it abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. That was its goal. Let me say that again. Communism abolishes religion and morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It's not trying to put forward these things. Its goal is the destruction of these things. So when we say, let's just flirt, it's just cool, I get it. In another passage of that dangerous little book, Marx said this. He said, abolish the family. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. What's this complement? The church. Let me say it again. Like he's openly saying that the goal of communism is to abolish the church and the family. He says, the bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed co-relation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry, all family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. This sounds like an evil guy in a movie that's like, ha, 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 I'll destroy it. And then he's like, yep, that's me. Much as Mein Kampf in 1925 would be a bald statement of Hitler's intentions should he ever attain power, the Communist Manifesto is likewise clear in stating the objectives of communism, i.e. the socialists, should they ever attain power. No one could justly say he wasn't forewarned, so it is too today when you have institutions like Black Lives Matter, where one finds all this restated, all the communist goals restated In rather oblique terms, they've changed the website since I read it, but you can find it archived. In one of our sermons, I read through it. Although there's no indication that Marx and Spurgeon ever met. If you don't know who Spurgeon is, he's one of the great preachers of the world. One was almost certainly aware of the other and the irreconcilable nature of the messages each proclaimed. Both achieved fame in his own lifetime, and while Spurgeon's fame eclipsed that of Marx during the 1850s and 60s, Marx's message of secular salvation gained in prominence after the publication of the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867. So you have Spurgeon talking about true salvation and Marx offering a utopian salvation that was fake. Especially after the failure of the Paris Commune in 1871, and in his post-Paris Commune period, Spurgeon begins to take note of Marx's philosophy, if not the man himself. All of a sudden, Spurgeon's like, who's this Marx guy? Uh-oh. It'd be wrong to say, as many preachers do, that addressing matters of politics falls outside the purview of the clergy. Of no other sphere of life do they say it. What other sphere of life can I not talk about? Regardless, Spurgeon certainly didn't agree with this sentiment. And I would also just simply say that Marxism isn't politics. It's politics delving into my world, into the world of religion. But of no other sphere of life do we say it. Regardless, Spurgeon didn't agree with the sentiment. Christianity isn't merely an accessory to man's life. It should define it. And thus, a man's politics are simply outward manifestations of the conviction of the heart. Socialism, Spurgeon knew, was much more than an economic or political question. And this is before they even had the cultural Marxism that we have today. He says it's a spiritual question, if only because it denies the very existence of what's spiritual. It is, as I've written elsewhere, atheism masquerading as anti-theism, really, masquerading as a political philosophy. Spurgeon had, in fact, noted the dangers of socialism remarkably early in his ministry. In 1855, he warned of communists who wanted nothing less than the real disruption of all society as at present established. Let me say this again. This is from 1855, Spurgeon said, quoted communists saying their goal was the real disruption of all society as it's presently established. He asked the gathered, Spurgeon said, would you desire reigns of terror here as they had in France? Do you wish to see all society shattered and men wandering like monster icebergs on the sea, dashing against each other and being at last utterly destroyed? Monster icebergs, what a statement. We're constantly around one another and constantly isolated. I love Spurgeon's language. He just nails it to the wall. But it is in the post-1871 period that he speaks more frequently and with greater urgency of the subject of socialism. In other words, what happened is Spurgeon started to become more urgent in his warnings. In a sermon on Psalm 118 on June 1878, Spurgeon made a tentative prediction to his congregation. German rationalism has ripened into socialism. This is what he writes. Yet many pollute the mass of mankind and lead them to overturn the foundations of society. Then advanced principles will hold carnival and free thought. When he says advanced principles will hold carnival and free thought, atheism will riot with the vice and the blood, which were years ago the insignia of the age of reason. I say not that it will be so, but I should not wonder if it came to pass, for deadly principles are abroad and certain ministers are spreading them. I love how he just says it. In a sermon on Isaiah 66 in 1889, Spurgeon recognized that many confused the gospel of Jesus Christ with the cheap secular knockoff proclaimed by Marx and his ilk. Isn't that the truth? We repaint Jesus as a Marxist going around trying to redistribute wealth. That's the thing, right? This is what Spurgeon said about it. Here's his quote. He says, for many a year, by the grand old truths of the gospel, sinners were converted and saints were edified, and the world was made to know that there is a God in Israel. But these are too antiquated for the present cultured race of superior beings. They're going to regenerate the world by democratic socialism and set up a kingdom for Christ without the new birth or of the pardon of sin. Truly, the Lord has not taken away the 7,000 and not bowed the knee to Baal. The latter-day gospel is not the gospel by which we were saved. To me, it seems a tangle of ever-changing dreams. It is, by the confession of its inventors, the outcome of the period, the monstrous birth of a boasted progress, the scum from the cauldron of conceit. It has not been given by the infallible revelation of God. It does not pretend to have been. It is not divine. It has no inspired scripture at its back. It is, when it touches the cross, an enemy. When it speaks of him who died thereon, it is a deceitful friend. Many are its sneers at the truth of substitution. What he's saying is when you meet people that want to talk about Jesus Christ but put forward these communist ideas and you actually get to the actual atonement, they'll scoff at the atonement. They'll call it divine child abuse. They'll scoff at the blood of Christ that saves us and washes us clean. He says, in fact, men are not now to be saved by faith but by doubt according to them. Those who love the church of God feel heavy at heart because the teachers of the people cause them to err. And even from a national point of view, men of foresight can see cause for grave concern. The reference to bowing knees is prescient given the events of our own time, he says, but it must be noted where Spurgeon lays the blame for the state of things. Like Francis Schaeffer a century later, he places squarely on men of his own vocation, on preachers. As if to assail the heresy. What is he saying when he says that's on preachers? Marxism's greatest friend is the dumb claptrap that we call American evangelicalism. It is the people that put forward the me-centered, self-centered, non-thinking ideology where the church has lost all of its natural antibodies that stands against error. And we just repeat whatever mantra comes out, like a leaf tossed every way to and fro from doctrine. People come to churches hungry to find meaning, truth, and things defined. And what we do is we just toss them with the leaves and toss them with the winds. He says this, as if to assail the heresy that would infect the pulpits of the Western world, Spurgeon speaks directly to the political climate. Indeed, if there were lines prescribing the lane in which he was a clergyman was to remain, he refused to acknowledge them. Like a charioteer in the Circus Maximus, he thrashed the fleet-footed horses carrying the gospel he preached right across every lane in human endeavor, especially those that presumed to exalt themselves above God, as socialism surely does. Do we really live in a time where the government is the one that controls the weather? And we're like, yeah, that makes sense. Apart from Kim Jong-un, I've met and engaged the most famous atheists of this age. Likewise, like every one of them, Marx belonged to that category of men that Romans 1 calls haters of God. There's a totally different author saying the same thing. One simply does not set up idols and altars if he's anything else. He says, Marx himself was not unaware of how easily some confuse the authentic for the false. He sought to exploit it. Nothing he wrote in the Communist Manifesto was easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. For this reason, Spurgeon combated Marx and his ideas just as the Apostle John had once opposed Cerinthus, and Augustine had to use his formal intellect to confront Pelagius. Great schemes of socialism have been tried and found lacking, Spurgeon invade in another sermon. Let us look to regeneration by the Son of God, and we shall not look in vain. What he's saying is, let me give you an example of what I mean. A bunch of preachers wearing sweater vests over their, North Face vests over their collared shirts, got up right during the BLM thing and talked about how the gospel's goal is a start in getting us to see our complicity in systemic racism. And I remember preaching in the pulpit trying to tell you again, the gospel is being used in these comments as a tool to get us to some utopian view of society, and that's totally at odds with what the Bible says. And I warned from this pulpit, I don't even know if people understood what I was saying, but I was saying again and again that the goal here is to see this, that the gospel is not a means to some other utopian end, but the gospel has to be the end in and of itself. The gospel isn't the means to people then having good race relations. The gospel is the end in which all are one in Christ Jesus. You don't have African-American Christians, white Christians, black Christians, red Christians, green Christians. You don't have any hyphens with Christianity. The gospel is the end, not the means to an end. That's the Christian gospel that Spurgeon fought for against the socialistic idea that the gospel is a tool in the tool belt to help us to achieve our socialist ends, which you all heard. If you went on the internet at anyone, heard many popular preachers in the last year or two. Today, the battlefield's continued. Marxism morphs as it goes, disguising itself until it reaches our own time in sheep's clothing of racial equity and so-called social justice. It's pure Marxism. Today, the battle continues. The gospel, however, remains remarkably unchanged. Its power to transform societies is one of the most underrated benefits of Christian belief. Through the inward transformation of the individual, through the sharing of the gospel, society does change, right? It's the grace effect. No greater scam has been perpetrated on so many for so long than the lie that socialism, once adopted, will reorganize society along the lines of a utopia for all. How many sort of reparations can you pay before it's good again? How many times can you be equitable when finally we can then get along with just actually like bringing prosperity to everybody in our country? Like, it's never going to be enough. As Spurgeon so eloquently put it, to attempt national regeneration without personal regeneration is a dream of erecting a house without separate bricks. In other words, Christian, one of the things that irritates me, and I'm going to end it here, is there's a movement recently, and I've kind of been pointed out, of individuals who really see the Christian gospel's answer to social ills like the communism, the things that we see, as what they call a manly Christianity. Recently, Moscow, Idaho, Doug Wilson put out an ad for their university, which has a picture of Johnny Cash flipping the bird at the camera. And it says, we require men, whatever. It says some article about having men who want to follow Christ and sometimes have to flip the bird at idolatry. I'm like, and really, it was just seeker-sensitive claptrap dressed up in another name. It's just seeking the idea like, I got to stand up and be a real man. because I'm going to flip the bird at ideology. That's not the answer. What it's basically advocating for is we got to go try to change society before the Marxists do. We got to go infiltrate society before the Marxists do. Listen to me. That is stupid. It's also not biblical. I wish, it sounds like those guys should have given some advice to the Apostle Paul, who told, Onesimus to go back to Philemon. He's not like, we got to get rid of this slave thing. It doesn't sound like Jesus wanted to fix the Roman tax system. Like when you look in the Bible doesn't aim at transforming society because a perfect king is coming with perfect justice. God doesn't want like a compromised peace in this world. He's going to have perfect and world perfection. He's going to come and bring it with a rod of iron. It's not going to be a democracy. It's going to be a king. And he's coming. And that perfect kingdom is coming. In the meantime, as we go out and make disciples, the way you challenge the sort of Marxist ideology is the way it infiltrates, as we talked about last week and the rest in our lives. So like I said, don't vote for Marxist ideologies. Oppose them when you see them as Americans. Understand your role in Romans 16 as an American, you're not a British citizen. But all that aside, as a church, I'm going to keep hitting this again and again and again and again. The most radical thing you can do is not to allow cultural Marxism to win. Remember, the two enemies that Marx put forward was the church and the family. Both things we're involved in right now. We're doing those things right now. So you don't have to go out and go flip the bird at ideology, at idolatry. What you need to do is be strong about, as we said on Sunday, the roles that God's given us and understand them and press into them and understand them and celebrate them. Come to church, love the church, be a good wife, a good husband. We kept saying over and over again, there's nothing more tangibly opposition to the dumb Marxist ideology than strong families and strong churches that aren't compromising. And guys, there's so much confusion. It's interesting. We have a lot of people that weren't believers here on Sunday. And that sermon I preached a few years ago, a lot of non-believers would be really offended. Most of the non-believers were actually refreshed. I've gotten zero emails on that sermon when I said, wives, submit your husbands. Children, obey your parents. Like, listen to your elders. I'm like, that's the sermon the pastor's like, it's kind of, I don't know if I like it. The atheists that came here at the sermon, I didn't get any letters pushing back about how mean and bad that was. You know why? Because everyone's looking for someone to say something true. Even atheists. Like it's one of the things that it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump's such an idiot right now when he's trying to like pander to the sort of the abortionist crowd. Like they already have Kamala Harris. They don't need him to do that. Like it's just a dumb thing. Churches are the same way. You don't need to pander to the world, guys. Like you don't need to pander to the world in your gender roles. If you're women and you're out and someone sends you feminist stuff, you don't have to get on a screed and deny it, but you just be proud to be a wife. The Bible doesn't say women submit to men, it says wives submit to your husbands. Do it boldly. Don't be shy about it. Don't make jokes. Happy wife, happy life. Like grow up. Teach your kids the true things. Like this stuff right now matters. And guys, I'm telling you right now, when you're serious about the gospel, we're serious about the church and the community of the church and the families in the church, you are going to have people come here in droves because the darkness is getting darker and there needs to be light that's shining. So we're going through this book. We want us to understand these things and help our young people and ourselves not to be fools in our folly. And in the meantime, we're going to boldly recognize that what Marxism recognizes, that the church and the family are absolutely important and worth fighting over. Let's pray. God, as we come to this book and we get started, I pray that you would bless it. It's a lot of heavy stuff, but help us understand our time at bat. Bring clarity, help us understand what's going on, but help us to get excited that you chose us for such a time as this. Lord, I'm so thankful for things like air conditioning and cars and the internet and things we do. We don't have to hide in holes somewhere. But I do ask right now for our own nation. We deserve in so many ways to be destroyed. We're a nation that has abandoned you. But Father, just like Lot and those people in Sodom and Gomorrah, you said that you wouldn't destroy it if there were some righteous people in your churches here, God, and I pray that you would hold off and you would bring blessings to this nation. We don't deserve it, but I ask for it. And I ask that we would have elections that do keep us from the precipice of becoming more and more openly atheistic Marxist in such a way that harms people made in your image. God, help us to vote, help us to get out and do these things, but in the meantime, help us to know our role. Help us know the power of the gospel. Marx understood it. That's why he opposed it. Help us to understand it and share it. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.
This is Pastor Matt Smith, Senior Pastor of Barabbas Road Church. For the past 16 years, it has been my joy to equip the saints for the work of the ministry by preaching the Bible verse by verse, line by line, the whole counsel of God. Our audio and video messages have reached over 158 countries and are listened to by over 5,000 people each week. Many of you who listen weekly have been through our doors, and I'm thankful that you continue to use us as a resource for your enrichment and edification. We consider you all a part of our extended church family. As you know, San Diego is a spiritually dark and financially difficult place to exist as a local church, and yet By God's plan and purpose, he's placed us here to boldly challenge the false faith by teaching that Jesus is the only way, truth, and life. My desire is that we would continue to be a bastion of light in this dark area, that we would keep bringing you consistent biblical teaching on a weekly basis. To that end, I'm asking that you would prayerfully consider partnering with us in your missions giving. To do so, go to Barabbas.com/give. I'm thankful for this task and look forward to our partnership for years to come.